A rescue helicopter doesn't just fall out of the sky. In calm weather, not with an experienced pilot. Unless someone makes it, Percy. Not unless someone makes it fall. In the frozen mountains of northern Montana on a night when the blizzard screamed loud enough to drown out everything, a woman was supposed to disappear. Her evidence was supposed to burn, and the secret buried beneath White Glass Ridge was supposed to stay buried forever. They almost got away with it. Almost. Because nobody bothered to check who else was walking through that storm. Subscribe right now, hit that bell, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, and trust me, you do not want to walk away before this one ends. Temperature dropped 14 degrees in under 2 hours. Wasn't unusual for late November in the Whitefish Range. What was unusual was the silence that settled between the gusts, that specific, loaded kind of quiet that felt like peace and more like the mountain holding its breath. Gavin Rourke had spent enough time in places where silence preceded catastrophe to recognize the difference. He'd learned that distinction not in Montana, but in places whose names he wasn't cleared to say out loud. Places where the wrong kind of quiet meant someone was about to start shooting. He wasn't supposed to be thinking about any of that right now. Was the whole point of being here. He adjusted the weight of his pack, 62 pounds, mostly gear, a few days of rations, one change of thermal underlayer, and pushed another 100 meters through snow that came up past his knees. The trees here were old-growth Douglas fir, massive and dark, their branches sagging under accumulated ice. In the beam of his headlamp, they looked like soldiers asleep standing up. The trail had disappeared, somewhere around the 3-mile mark. Was navigating by compass and memory now, cross-referencing the topographic map he'd committed to memory back at the trailhead before cell service died completely. Behind him, Rex moved through the snow without a sound. The German Shepherd was 4 years old, 78 pounds, and had more operational hours in hostile terrain than most humans Gavin had served alongside. He'd been assigned to Gavin 18 months ago through a working dog program that paired handlers with animals mid-career, and in those 18 months the dog had never once given Gavin a reason to doubt him. Rex didn't whine, didn't hesitate, didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter. In that way, he was probably better adjusted than his handler. Gavin's leave had started 11 days ago. His commanding officer, a compact, hard-eyed master chief named Dillard, had pulled him aside after the debrief on their last rotation and said Rourke, "You need to not be here for a while. Go somewhere cold and quiet and don't talk to anyone." Dillard wasn't a man who gave advice casually. So Gavin had driven north from San Diego, traded his truck for a permit at a ranger station in a town with a population under 400, and started walking into the Whitefish backcountry with no particular destination and no particular timeline. He'd told exactly 3 people where he was going. One was Dillard, one was his sister in Spokane, one was a contact at the VA he'd been required to inform as part of an ongoing check-in protocol he participated in voluntarily but found faintly irritating. None of them expected to hear from him for at least a week. That was the plan. Plans, in Gavin's experience, had a persistent habit of not surviving contact with reality. He'd been pushing toward a ridgeline campsite he'd used years ago before his first deployment. When he'd come up here with his father during a hunting trip that had produced no deer, and approximately 40 hours of the most uncomfortable silence 2 emotionally constipated men had ever shared when Rex stopped. Slowed, stopped, full stop, body rigid, weight shifted forward onto his front legs. Head angled toward the northeast, toward the upper ridge. Gavin stopped immediately. His hand dropped without conscious thought to the fixed blade knife on his right hip, the only weapon he'd brought into the backcountry. Because bringing a firearm into a wilderness area for no reason except old habit felt like the kind of thing that confirmed people's worst assumptions about veterans, and he was trying very hard not to be a walking stereotype. He stood still and listened, wind snow hissing against bark, the deep structural creak of an old fir shifting under ice weight. Underneath all of it, punching through like a signal through static, a sound. Metallic, violent. The specific percussive boom of something large and hollow being introduced catastrophically to something solid and immovable. It wasn't thunder, he knew thunder. This was mechanical failure at speed. This was the sound of an aircraft coming apart. Rex was already moving. Rex, heel. The dog dropped back to his left flank immediately, but kept his gaze locked on the ridge. Gavin pulled the compass, oriented himself, estimated the sound's origin at roughly 280 degrees from their current heading, somewhere on the upper northeastern face of White Glass Ridge. Killed his headlamp. Gave his eyes 30 seconds to adjust to the dark and the blue-white ambient light bouncing off the snow. Then he moved. The crash site was 400 meters through terrain that should have taken 20 minutes and took 8. Gavin moved fast in deep snow the way men trained for mountain warfare. Move fast, low center of gravity. Weight forward. Feet punching straight down rather than sweeping, wasted, lateral motion. Rex matched his pace perfectly, cutting a path slightly ahead and to the left, reading the ground with his nose, while Gavin read the environment with his eyes. He smelled the wreckage before he saw it. Hydraulic fluid. Hot metal. The sharp chemical bite of something electrical burning. Underneath everything, the unmistakable copper penny smell of blood. Crested a slight rise, and there it was. The helicopter had come down in a narrow tree corridor, clipping 2 major firs on its way through and shedding its tail rotor assembly somewhere in the upper canopy. The main fuselage had impact on its left side and skidded nearly 30 meters through the snow before a granite outcropping had stopped it. The rotor blades were gone, separated on impact or sheared off against the trees. He couldn't tell without more light. The aircraft itself was a medium utility configuration, forest green with agency markings along the side that were partially obscured by impact deformation. He scanned the perimeter in a fast 360. No movement. Tracks in the snow, except the debris field from the crash. Whoever had been in that helicopter had either not survived or hadn't walked out. Rex, seek. The dog put his nose down and moved immediately toward the wreckage. Gavin followed, pulling his headlamp back on but shielding the beam with his hand, minimal light signature, old instinct, and moving in a wide arc around the debris field to approach from the uphill side. He found the pilot first. The man was still strapped in, which meant the crash harness had done its job up until the point where the instrument panel had compressed inward at roughly 40 kilometers per hour. There was nothing Gavin could do for the pilot. He confirmed that in under 4 seconds and moved on. Then Rex stopped at the rear cargo door, which had been peeled partially open by the impact, and barked once. Sharp controlled. Here. Gavin got the door the rest of the way open. She was pinned under a collapsed equipment rack, conscious but barely, her face covered in a mixture of blood and melted snow that told him, for at least she was wearing a wilderness officer's uniform. The specific agency patches were torn, but the color and cut were distinctive, and she was breathing in the way people breathe when they're fighting to stay present. Against the kind of pain that wants to pull you under. He kept his voice level. My name's Gavin. I'm going to get this rack off you. Move your head. Her eyes opened, dark, trying to focus. Atlas, she said. Her voice was wrecked. My dog. Front. Passenger harness. He was already moving. Passenger compartment was accessible through the collapsed forward section, and he had to remove his pack and move on his elbows to reach it. K9 was a Belgian Malinois, older than Rex, with a working harness and a reinforced collar that had probably saved his neck when the impact threw him forward against the restraint. The dog was alive, but not moving well, labored breathing, one rear leg positioned wrong. Good boy, Gavin said quietly. I've got you. He unclipped the harness and maneuvered the dog back through the gap, laying him in the snow with as much care as the space allowed. Rex approached and touched his nose to the older dog's muzzle. Atlas raised his head slightly, didn't growl. Then Gavin went back for the woman. Yes, he can. Getting her free of the equipment rack took 6 minutes and required him to use his knife to cut through a nylon strap that had looped around her left ankle during the impact. She had a head laceration that was bleeding more than it was dangerous, a probable broken rib on her right side, based on how she guarded it during movement, and a sprained or fractured wrist on her left. She told him none of this. He observed all of it. Can you stand? She tried. Okay. He repositioned her arm over his shoulder. I've got you. Tell me if anything gets worse. Everything is worse. Where are we? She stopped, looked at the wreckage. Something moved across her face that wasn't pain. It was older than pain. More complicated, the pilot. Yes. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Opened them. Okay. That single syllable carried about 60 pounds of weight. He recognized it the way soldiers compress grief into the smallest possible container, because the situation doesn't have space for anything larger right now. He'd used that same okay in a helicopter in Oman once, and in a firebase in a country he couldn't name, and in a hospital corridor in Germany, waiting for news about a teammate. I'll fall apart later. Right now I need to stay functional. What's your name? He asked. Vaughn. Tessa Vaughn. Wilderness officer? Senior field officer. Temporarily senior. Complicated. She winced as they moved. You're not a ranger. Hiker? Something like that. She looked at him sideways. Even injured. Blizzard. Having just survived a helicopter crash, she had the kind of eyes that told you she was running calculations behind. Your dog found me in under 2 minutes in a whiteout. Rexa, he's well trained. So are you. It wasn't a question. She filed whatever conclusion she reached and let it go. There's a fire watch cabin, 2 kilometers northeast, approximately. Old Forest Service structure. It should be stocked. He did. Barely it had been marked on the topographic map as a seasonal maintenance point. Can you tell me your injury status? Walk me through it. Head wound probably needs closure. Rib on the right, breathing hurts, but I can breathe. Wrist left, likely fracture. Vision is intermittent. Could be concussion. She delivered this inventory the way someone trained to observe and report delivers information. Factual. No dramatics. He revised his assessment of her upward. Atlas needs to be carried, she added. He won't make it 2 kilometers on his own. Gavin looked at the Malinois, then at his pack, then at Tessa. He ran the math. 62-pound pack, a dog that probably weighed 65 pounds, a woman who was injured and could walk but not carry weight. 2 kilometers in heavy snow in a blizzard. All right, he said. He rigged a carry system for Atlas out of a space blanket and 2 compression straps from his pack, distributing the dog's weight across his chest and left shoulder while Tessa took his right arm for support. Rex took point ahead of them, moving at a pace they could match, checking back every 30 meters with automatic precision. They moved northeast into the dark. Cabin was exactly where Tessa had said it would be, which told him she knew this terrain at a level beyond casual familiarity. It was a single-room structure, timber frame, with a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall and a small woodshed attached to the east side that still had 3 seasons' worth of split pine stacked dense inside. Emergency supplies, first aid, basic rations, a hand-crank weather radio were in a sealed metal box under the single cot. He got the fire going in under 4 minutes. Fed it carefully small fuel first, then larger splits once the kindling caught, building heat without overwhelming the cold-soaked stone. Laid Atlas on the folded wool blanket from the supply box close to the fire. The dog was fading but stable, breathing easier in the warmth. Tessa sat on the cot and watched him work. You're not going to tell me what you actually do, she said. I'm on leave. That's not an answer. No. He opened the first aid kit and started laying out what he needed. It isn't. She absorbed that. The fire was starting to push the cold back, and in the growing warmth, the full extent of the head wound became visible, a 3-inch laceration across her left temple that had bled dramatically but was already slowing. He cleaned it, closed it with the steri strips from the kit, and taped a gauze pad over it with the waterproof medical tape. You've done this before, she said. It wasn't a question either. Hold still. I'm not moving. You're talking. Talking moves your head. She stopped talking. He finished the closure. Her wrist, Once he unwrapped the sleeve, showed a significant bruise spreading from the base of her palm and a slight deformity at the distal radius that suggested a clean fracture rather than a complex one. He splinted it with 2 strips of SAM splint from the kit and wrapped it tight enough to reduce swelling without cutting circulation. She gritted her teeth through the splinting, but didn't make a sound. "The rib," he said. "Nothing you can do for ribs. I'm going to tape it. It won't fix it, but it'll help you breathe." She lifted her uniform shirt without being asked. 3 ribs on the right side showed bruising severe enough to be visible, even in firelight. He taped them while she stared at the opposite wall and breathed carefully through her nose. He said. She lowered her shirt, looked at Atlas. The dog had closed his eyes, but his flanks were moving steadily. "He's going to be okay," Gavin said. "You don't know that. But his respiration is stable, and he's not shocky anymore. Cold was the main problem. He's warming up." Something crossed her face relief so intense, it looked briefly like grief, and she turned her head away. He got up and checked the weather radio, giving her a moment that she clearly needed and clearly would not ask for. The radio pulled a signal on the 3rd try. The report was brutal. The storm was a Category 3 winter system, winds gusting to 75 kilometers per hour on the upper ridges, visibility near zero at elevation, projected break-in conditions for at least 18 hours. Emergency frequencies were active on the channels, he checked, which meant the crash either hadn't been reported yet, or the people who needed to know about it already knew. He set the radio down and turned back to the room. Tessa was looking at him. She'd used the moment he gave her to pull herself back together, and whatever she was feeling now was back behind a door she'd locked from the inside. Something else in her expression, something calculating and urgent that he hadn't seen there before. "Need to tell you something," she said. "Okay. Before I do," she paused. "What's your actual background? Not looking for details. Just need to know what I'm working with." He considered. "Special operations. Active duty. Currently on temporary leave." She nodded slowly. Like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. That changes the calculus here. "Tell me." She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at him directly. "That crash was not an accident. The room was quiet except for the wind outside and the creak of the fire," he said. Her eyes sharpened. "How?" "Clean puncture through the frame. Left side aft of the cargo door. Entered at an angle consistent with a projectile fired from elevation. Branching fractures around the entry point, which means it wasn't impact debris. He'd found it in the wreck site during those 4 seconds he'd had while he was confirming the pilot. Yes, hadn't mentioned it until now. Someone hit you from the ridge." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Tessa exhaled slowly through her nose. "How long have you known?" "Since the wreck site. And you didn't say anything. You were in shock, and you needed a fire, and your dog needed warmth. There wasn't a useful window." She absorbed this, nodded once. "'Kay, fair." Another breath. "Here's what you don't know yet," she told him. It had started 8 months ago, in late February, when Tessa had been conducting a routine aerial survey of the protected wilderness corridor west of White Glass Ridge. She'd flagged anomalous heat signatures in a valley sector that should have been uninhabited and logged a formal notation in the agency database. Her supervisor, a district manager named Harland, she described in a tone that suggested she was being very careful to keep her language professional, had reviewed the notation and closed it within 48 hours. "Equipment malfunction," he'd said. "Sensor calibration issue. Common in cold weather operations." She'd let it go. The second incident came in April. She'd been on a ground patrol following wolfpack movement when she'd encountered fresh tracked vehicle paths in an area where no authorized vehicle traffic had been permitted. The tracks led northeast toward the Upper Ridge sector, the same general area as the February heat signatures. She'd photographed them, recorded coordinates, filed a second report. Harland had called her into his office the following week. "He didn't threaten me," she said. "He was very polite about it. He said I was showing a pattern of over-reporting. That I was new to the district and still calibrating my observation thresholds, that the vehicle tracks were probably from a licensed maintenance contractor he'd already cleared. All very reasonable, very calm. Her jaw tightened slightly. Checked the contractor clearance records afterward. Authorized maintenance operations in that sector for the past 2 years. You didn't push back. I pushed back. I just didn't do it loudly. She shifted her weight on the cot and winced. I started keeping a separate record, personal, not in the agency system. Over the following 4 months, she documented 6 separate incidents, unauthorized cargo flight patterns crossing the protected corridor at hours not covered by standard agency monitoring windows, ground-level supply caches discovered and photographed in 2 locations before being removed within days of her documentation, a brief radio exchange she'd intercepted on a frequency that shouldn't have been in use in the sector. Flights were systematic, she said. Same general corridor, same altitude windows, always between 2 and 4 in the morning when satellite coverage in that valley is lowest. Whatever they're building up there, extracting, constructing, I don't know exactly. It's been in active development for at least 6 months. Record you've been keeping. She reached up and touched Atlas's collar. The gesture was too deliberate to be unconscious. Gavin looked at the collar. Really looked at it this time. It was heavier than standard, reinforced, layered, with a rectangular section on the underside that he'd initially registered as a GPS tracker housing. It's not a GPS unit, he said. It's a modified data storage unit. Waterproof, shockproof. Everything I've collected: coordinates, flight schedules, photographs, financial records I pulled from a contractor database through a public records request. It's all on there. She met his eyes. 3 copies. 2 are in secure locations off mountain. That one is the only physical copy. The implications arranged themselves in Gavin's mind with the same clarity that tactical problems arranged themselves when the noise dropped away and the objective became visible. She was the evidence. Atlas was carrying the evidence. Someone had shot down the helicopter to eliminate both. How many people know what you've found? He asked. 2 people I trust completely. My brother, who has instructions on what to do with the information if I go dark for more than 72 hours. And a federal investigator I contacted 3 weeks ago, a woman named Park, with Interior's Inspector General Office. She's been reviewing the preliminary material. The crash was supposed to be my transport to a secure briefing. I was supposed to meet her team tomorrow morning. Supposed to be, he said. Someone knew about it. Her voice was flat and certain. Someone with access to flight scheduling. Someone who could vector shooter onto our position and time it to look like weather-related mechanical failure. Gavin stood. He walked to the cabin's single window, a small, frost-covered rectangle that faced west, and looked out into the storm. Pines were bending in the wind. The snow was moving in horizontal sheets. Visibility was maybe 15 meters. He did a threat assessment, the way he'd been trained to do one, methodically. Panic, with Ute starting from what he knew and building outward. Crash was targeted. No, Tessa was the primary target. Her evidence was with her. No communications currently available. Weather had grounded all aviation for at least 18 hours. How quickly the shooter would confirm non-survivors. He sat unknown, whether a ground element was already moving toward the crash site. How many people comprised the threat network? He turned back from the window. Do you have any weapons? Service sidearm. Lost it in the crash. She read his expression. You don't have a firearm. Special operations soldier who went into a wilderness area without a weapon. I was supposed to be alone. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind shifted and slammed a new gust against the wall, hard enough to rattle the chimney stack. The fire responded by pulling hard toward the flue. What do we do? She asked. It was a reasonable question. It was also used. Gavin suspected, the first time in a very long time, that Tessa Vaughn had asked anyone else that question, and the fact that she was asking it now was a measure of exactly how clearly she was reading the situation. He opened his mouth to answer. Rex rose from beside the door. Gradually, not sleepily, all at once body rigid, ears forward, weight loaded onto his front legs. The same posture he'd taken beside the creek, an hour and a lifetime ago. The dog stared at the door, and then, from somewhere out in the storm from the direction of the tree line, from somewhere in that 15 meters of visibility that separated the cabin from the dark, came a sound that had no business being there. A boot crunching snow, deliberate, careful, trying and failing to be quiet. One set of footsteps. 3. Rex didn't bark. That was the thing that made Gavin's chest go cold in a way the blizzard hadn't managed. Trained working dog barks at a threat when it wants the handler to know. Stays silent when it's been taught that silence is the more dangerous response when the situation has crossed from alert into something that requires the human to make decisions quietly and fast. Rex was silent. Gavin crossed the cabin in 4 steps. He didn't run. Running creates noise and noise creates information, and right now the only advantage they had was that whoever was outside didn't know exactly what they were walking into. He reached Tessa and put his hand on her shoulder, light pressure, a single downward push. Get low. Stay low. She understood immediately, slid off the cot and onto the floor without a word, pulling herself toward the base of the stone fireplace where the thick granite blocks would stop anything short of a rifle round. She brought Atlas with her, one arm under the dog's chest, moving him inches at a time. Gavin killed the lamp. The cabin dropped to firelight, only orange and jumping, throwing shadows that moved more than the people in them. He pressed himself against the wall beside the window, below the glass, and slowly raised his eyes over the sill to look out. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the tree line roughly 20 meters from the cabin door. They were using handheld flashlights rather than headlamps, which was a choice. Headlamps were more practical in these conditions. Handheld flashlights could be pointed, could be used to signal. Could be switched off quickly without the motion of reaching to your forehead. These men were thinking tactically, even if they were trying not to look like it. They were also wearing civilian gear, high-end winter kit, Gore-Tex shells, insulated boots, but none of it matched. 3 different brands, 3 different color schemes. A coordinated team uniform, which meant either they'd assembled quickly from whatever was available, or they were deliberately avoiding the kind of visual consistency that would identify them as an organized unit. Search and rescue teams wore matching gear. They wore agency patches. They announced themselves with light and noise and radio chatter because their job was to be found, not to find. These men had no patches, no visible radios, and they had been standing at the edge of those trees for nearly 90 seconds without moving, which was not how you behaved if you were trying to reach an injured crash survivor. That was how you behaved if you were trying to determine whether the people inside already knew you were there. Gavin pulled back from the window. He moved to the fireplace and crouched beside Tessa. 3 of them, he said, voice barely above a breath. Can't confirm at this range. Assume yes. She was quiet for a second. The door has a bolt. Wood frame bolt on a timber door. It'll slow them down by about 4 seconds. Better than nothing. Marginally. He looked around the cabin. Firelight. Taking rapid inventory. The supply box. Still open, with its first aid contents spread across the cot. A hand axe mounted on the east wall fire-splitting tool. Old but solid. 2 lengths of heavy chain used to secure the firewood rack. A cast iron skillet on the small stove. The cot frame itself, solid pine, probably 80 pounds of old wood and iron bolts. Firearms. No radio that would reach anyone through this storm. Way out except the front door or the woodshed attached to the east wall, which would put whoever used it directly in the open 15 meters from the tree line. He did the math the way he always did math in situations like this, not by calculating the odds of success, but by identifying the variables he could control and the ones he couldn't, and then arranging everything in his favor within those constraints. What he could control, timing, terrain inside the cabin, the element of surprise specifically, the surprise of not being what they expected. What he couldn't control, numbers, weapons, whether there were additional elements outside his current visibility. "No. They're going to knock," he said. Tessa looked at him. "People who intend to kill you without complication don't announce themselves. They're going to try the polite version first. See if we open the door voluntarily. And if we don't, then they stop being polite." He reached up and took the hand axe off the wall mount. Tested its weight. The handle was hickory, dry, no rot. The head was solid. "Tell me everything you know about what's on the other end of those supply chains. The extraction site. What they're pulling out of that valley." She blinked now. "I need to understand what we're worth to them. What the risk calculation looks like from their side." She processed that and accepted it. "Mineral extraction, I think. The flight manifests I documented showed cargo weights consistent with equipment rather than raw material on the inbound runs. Processing equipment. The outbound signatures were heavier. The valley has documented geological surveys from the 1970s, significant deposits of rare earth elements. Neodymium, dysprosium, the kind of thing that's worth to shoot down a government helicopter. Yes. And enough to send a ground team through a Category 3 blizzard to confirm no survivors. Apparently, he nodded. The picture was complete enough. Wasn't desperate improvisation on someone's part. This was a contingency operation that had been planned and resourced in advance, which meant the people outside were professionals, or close enough to professionals that the distinction wouldn't matter much in the next few minutes. 3 knocks on the cabin door. Measured. Patient. Gavin and Tessa looked at each other across the firelight. "Search and rescue," a man's voice called from outside. Midwest accent, flat and practiced. "We got a report of a downed aircraft in this sector." "Anyone inside?" Tessa started to move toward the door. Gavin put his hand on her arm. She froze, looked at him. He shook his head once. She understood, stayed still. Another knock. "Hello? We're here to help. If there are survivors from the crash, we need you to identify yourselves." The voice was good. The cadence was right, not too urgent, not too calm. Kind of voice that had probably been effective before. Gavin had used similar tones himself in situations where he needed people to open a door without thinking too hard about why they were doing it. "Body's buying it," Tessa murmured. "They don't need us to buy it. They need us to hesitate long enough to exploded inward." The glass, the entire frame, hit from outside by something heavy and deliberate. Cold air and snow blasted into the cabin as Gavin was already moving, using the momentum of his turn toward the sound to drop below the frame's level. The man coming through the window, broad-shouldered, moving fast, flashlight's left hand, and something dark in his right, passed over Gavin's head and hit the floor on the other side of him. The front door came open at the same moment. The bolt held for exactly 3 seconds. Then the wood around the latch gave way, and the doors swung inward hard enough to crack against the interior wall. 2 points of entry, near simultaneous, coordinated. These weren't panicked amateurs. Gavin came up from the floor. The man from the window was already trying to orient himself, flashlight swinging to locate threats, the dark object in his right hand, resolving in the firelight into a compact semi-automatic pistol. Gavin hit his right wrist, first not the gun, the wrist, because disabling the joint was faster and more reliable than going for the weapon directly, and the gun went sideways without a shot fired. The man was large, probably 220, and he recovered faster than most would, spinning and driving an elbow toward Gavin's face. Gavin wasn't there. He'd already moved inside the arc of the swing, and what happened next was brief and unpleasant, and resulted in the large man sitting down very suddenly on the cabin floor with his arm at an angle that arms don't usually achieve. Rex was already engaged with the man from the front door. The second intruder had come in with his flashlight leading, scanning for targets, and Rex had come off the floor from beside the door in total silence and hit him at knee level with 78 pounds of velocity. The man went down. Rex held him there, not biting, not yet. Just weight and teeth, visible in the firelight with the focused, almost bored efficiency of a dog who has done this exact thing many times before and found it manageable. The second man did not test the dog's patience. Gavin turned toward the door. The third figure was still in the doorway. He hadn't committed to entry. Standing in the threshold, wind and snow at his back, and he had both hands visible in front of him, and he was holding a compact radio rather than a weapon, and the expression on his face in the shifting firelight was not what Gavin expected. It was not fear, it was assessment. This man was looking at the room, at his colleague on the floor holding his arm, at Rex pinning the second man, at Tessa behind with something in her hand that turned out to be the cast iron skillet, and he was calculating. Running numbers. The expression of someone who had just learned that the situation was significantly different from the briefing he'd received. "You're not a ranger," the man in the doorway said. "You already said that once tonight," Tessa said from behind the fireplace. "Different guy. Same bad conclusion." The man's eyes moved to her, then back to Gavin. "You want to tell me who I'm actually talking to?" "I want to know who sent you," Gavin said. "I'm search and rescue. You came through the window." A pause. The wind hammered the open doorway around him, spraying snow into the cabin, and the fire pulled violently toward the draft. Was a miscommunication. "Sure, listen." The man's voice shifted. Still controlled, but the practiced warmth was gone. What was underneath it was harder and more honest. "You don't have comms. Nobody knows you're here. The storm's got another 15 hours minimum, and I've got 4 more people positioned between here and the crash site." He said it without heat. "Just facts. The math isn't complicated." 4 more people, Gavin said. 4 more people. And you're the one standing in my doorway telling me the math isn't complicated. Gavin tilted his head slightly. "The math was actually on your side. You wouldn't be talking." The man's jaw tightened. "Close the door," Gavin said. "You're letting the cold in." Something shifted in the standoff, some invisible weight that had been balanced between them, tipped a degree in one direction, and the man in the doorway made a decision. He stepped back, pulled the door closed behind him. His footsteps in the snow retreated toward the tree line. Gavin immediately moved to the damaged window frame, pressing himself against the wall beside it. He listened. 3 sets of footsteps, converging near the trees. The low murmur of a conversation he couldn't resolve through the wind. "He's calling someone," Tessa said quietly. "Yes. 4 people he mentioned. I don't know if there are actually 4 more. You think he was bluffing?" "I think he was telling me what he thought would work. Whether it's accurate is a different question." Gavin looked at the man with the compromised arm, then at Rex's detainee. Both of them were functional, but neither of them was going anywhere useful in the next few minutes. "We need to deal with these 2, and then rethink our position." "Rethink how?" "This cabin is a fixed point. They know where we are. The storm grounds air support, but it doesn't ground foot movement, and if there actually are additional elements outside, staying here gives them time to position around us." He looked at her. "Can you move? I could move before. I mean really move. Walk with support move. Fast move." She considered this with the honesty of someone who had learned that overstating capability in a crisis had consequences. "For a limited distance. My rib is going to be a problem." "What about Atlas?" They both looked at the Malinois. He had raised his head when the violence started and hadn't lowered it since. He was watching the room with the patient, damaged alertness of an animal that understood the situation better than it had any right to. "Can't run," Tessa said. I know. The weight of that settled between them. Gavin set it aside for the moment, because there was something more immediately pressing. Crossed to the man Rex was holding and crouched down. The man younger than the one in the doorway, mid-20s, with the kind of build that suggested someone who worked outdoors regularly, was staring at the ceiling with the focused calm of a person who has made a decision to stay very still. "I'm going to ask you one question," Gavin said. "And I want you to think about your answer carefully, because we're in a cabin in a blizzard with no communications, and I genuinely don't have a lot of patience for anything other than useful information. How many people are actually outside?" The young man's eyes moved to Gavin. "To Rex. 3, he said, including Marlin." "Marlin's the one who was in the doorway." "Yes, so 2 more plus Marlin." "Yes." Gavin nodded, stood up, looked at Tessa. He's probably lying about the numbers but telling the truth about the structure. There's a leader, Marlin, and he's got at least one more person positioned outside. How do you know he's telling the truth about the structure? Because that part doesn't help us. He pulled the rope from his pack. He always carried rope, always, and began securing the man's wrists. Vindictively, efficiently. The numbers are the negotiating chip. Structure is just what it is. Tessa watched him work. Who trained you? The Navy. The Navy trains a lot of people. All of them do this. He finished the wrist restraint, checked the circulation with 2 fingers, adjusted slightly. What's on that collar needs to get off this mountain. The investigator you mentioned. Park. Is there any way to reach her through the 2 people you trusted with backup copies? My brother has a contact protocol. If I don't check in within 72 hours, he's supposed to send everything to Park directly and contact the FBI field office in Missoula. She paused. 72 hours started when the helicopter went down. When did it go down? She looked at the window. The storm outside. Approximately 9:47 p.m. He checked his watch. So you have until approximately 9:47 p.m. on Friday before the protocol activates. It's Wednesday. Yes, 48 hours. Blizzard. In a cabin that was now a known fixed point to an unknown number of hostile elements, with 2 detainees, 2 injured dogs, 1 injured wilderness officer, communications. Gavin secured the second detainee and stood up. He walked back to the window frame, the ruined window that was now just a cold hole in the wall, with the wooden frame hanging half off its mounting, and looked out into the dark. Marlin and his remaining element had pulled back into the trees, which could mean they were waiting, could mean they were repositioning, could mean Marlin was actually calling for additional support, in which case the timeline compressed significantly. Could mean he was reporting upward to whoever had authorized shooting down a federal helicopter. In which case a new set of decisions were being made right now by people with more resources and less hesitation. Gavin picked up one of the flashlights the intruders had dropped. Examined it. Standard tactical flashlight. Quality hardware. No agency markings. He turned it over in his hands. Tessa. Yeah, the payment records you photographed. The financial connection between the contractors and the officials. Is there a name? Someone specific at the top of this. She was quiet for a moment. There are 3 names. I've had Park's people working on confirming the chain, but the central one, the one who appears in the most transactions, goes by an LLC designation. Harlan shows up as a signatory, but he's not the architect. He's the local manager. She shifted carefully, guarding her ribs. There's a name that appears twice in separate wire transfer records across 2 different payment structures. That shouldn't be connected. A name I recognized. Who? She told him. He stood very still for a moment. Intervened. Then he put the flashlight down on the supply box and looked at the ceiling for a second, in the way people look at ceilings when they're recalibrating. Complicates things, he said. Yes, significantly. She met his eyes across the firelight. That's why I was on my way to a secure briefing instead of filing a report in the district database. That's why the caller and not the agency server. That's why my brother has a dead man's switch instead of me just emailing Park directly. She paused. That name has people. Federal? Adjacent to federal. Enough reach that routing this through normal channels would have, she stopped, would have looked exactly like what happened tonight. Fire cracked. A log shifted and a column of sparks rose up the flue. Rex, still positioned near the front door, raised his head. The full alert response from before. Something subtler. His nostrils moving, reading the air coming through the gaps around the damaged door frame. Gavin watched the dog. Rex's ears came forward. Then, very faintly, almost swallowed entirely. By the wind came a sound from the woodshed on the east wall. The attached structure. The one Gavin had dismissed earlier as an exit point because it opened into the open ground toward the tree line. A scrape. Metal on metal. Someone was working the woodshed's exterior latch. The second approach. Not the door this time. Not the window. Marlin had been stalling. Move, Gavin said. Tessa was already moving. The woodshed door, connecting to the cabin interior, burst open, and the figure that came through it was not being cautious or measured or anything other than fast-moving low, using the door frame as cover for the first half second, and then sweeping toward the fireplace where Tessa had been positioned. Where Tessa was no longer positioned, she'd moved left, behind the heavy supply box, and the figure overshot her and had to redirect, and in the time that redirection took, two things happened simultaneously. Rex hit him from the right, and Gavin hit him from the left. What followed was chaotic in the way that close-quarters violence is always chaotic. Nothing clean, surgical, more survival than technique. The kind of thing that leaves bruises and torn knuckles, and the specific soreness that comes from putting your body into contact with another body that doesn't want to be stopped. The figure was strong and fast and trained to some level, and Gavin took an elbow across the cheek and a knee to his left thigh before he got control of the situation. And Rex took a boot to his shoulder that he shook off with a sound of pure irritation. When it was over, the third man was on the floor. The cabin had 3 detainees. Gavin had a cut on his cheekbone from the elbow, and his left thigh was going to hurt in the morning. He stood up and looked at Tessa. She was pressed against the east wall, the cast iron skillet still in her right hand, her splinted left wrist held tight against her body. She'd hit the third man once across the shoulders. With the skillet during the struggle, he'd felt the impact vibrate through the man's body from where he'd been holding him, and her face was white and tight with pain from the rib. "Still functional?" he asked. "Define functional," she said. He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. He moved to the ruined window again. Tree line was dark. He couldn't see Marlin. Couldn't hear anything through the wind except the wind. He had 3 men on his floor and 1 man in the trees, and the storm had another 12 or 13 hours to run, and the name Tessa had given him was echoing in the back of his mind like a frequency he couldn't tune out. He pulled the weather radio off the supply box and tried 3 emergency frequencies. Static on all of them. He tried the 4th, still static. He tried the 5th, a seldom-used Forest Service relay frequency. He knew from an old contact a number that wasn't in any public directory, and held the radio near his ear in the silence between wind gusts. White noise, then so faint it might have been interference, something that sounded almost like a carrier signal. A voice, just the underlying tone that meant a frequency was active somewhere. He held the radio absolutely still and waited. The carrier signal pulsed twice. Disappeared. Gavin stared at the radio. "What is it?" Tessa asked. He didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the name she'd given him, about the kind of infrastructure that name could access, about the fact that someone had known about a secure briefing that only a handful of people were supposed to know about, and about what that implied for the chain of information. About the possibility, not a certainty, not yet, but a possibility that had just climbed from negligible to worth considering that the cavalry Tessa was counting on might already know more about her situation than she thought, in the way she was hoping. He set the radio down. Outside, through the howling dark, Marlin's footsteps had stopped moving. The silence from the trees was different now, heavier. Kind of silence that meant someone out there had just received new instructions and was deciding what to do with them. Gavin looked at Atlas. The old Malinois had his eyes open and his head up, watching Gavin with the attentive, damaged patience of an animal that had been in worse situations than this and understood that the human next to him was the variable that mattered most right now. Gavin reached down and ran his hand once along the dog's reinforced collar. The evidence was still there, still intact. Everything Tessa had risked her career and her life and the lives of everyone around her to document all of it, right there, held together by an animal that had refused to stop protecting the person who trusted him. He straightened up. "We need to talk about the collar," he said. Tessa looked at him steadily. "What about it? If something happens to Atlas before this is over?" "Is going to happen to Atlas." "Tessa." She was quiet. "If something happens," he said again carefully, "where does the data go? Is it transferable?" She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire had burned down to coals while they'd been occupied with other things, and the cabin was darker now, the shadows deeper and closer. In the reduced light, her face was hard to read, but her eyes weren't. "There's a sequence," she said finally, "to pull the data from the unit. I'm the only one who knows it. Then you need to tell me." "I don't know you," she said. "I know you're military. I know you're competent. I know you made a choice tonight that you didn't have to make." She paused. "Why you made it?" He thought about Dillard telling him to go somewhere quiet. Thought about the reason behind that instruction, the thing that had happened on the last rotation that he hadn't told anyone about because there weren't words for it yet, or because the words existed but he hadn't been ready to use them. He thought about what it was like to stand in a place where the right thing to do was obvious, and to do it anyway, without needing it to be celebrated or explained. "Because Rex found her," he said, "and I don't leave people." It was the most he'd said about himself all night. Possibly the most honest thing he'd said to another person in months. Tessa looked at him. The coals in the fireplace shifted and a small tongue of flame rose briefly and died. "The sequence is 8 digits, she said, "starting with the year I made my first field report." She gave him the sequence, 8 digits, spoken once quietly in the near dark of a dying fire. Gavin repeated it back to her, exactly, and she nodded, and neither of them said anything else about it, because there was nothing else useful to say. Yes, he'd intervened. He committed the number to the same part of his memory where he kept radio frequencies and grid coordinates and the faces of people he needed to remember the part that didn't forget things regardless of what was happening to the rest of him. Then he fed the fire. Not because the warmth was the priority right now, but because light was. He needed to see the room, and he needed to be able to read Tessa's face, and he needed the 3 men on the floor to know they were visible. He stacked 2 fresh pine splits over the coals and waited while the bark caught and the flames rebuilt themselves. The 3 detainees were secured well enough. The one with the compromised arm had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when pain becomes the dominant experience, and talking requires more energy than it's worth. The one Rex had taken down was awake and watching everything with a calculating expression that Gavin noted and filed. The third, the one who'd come through the woodshed, was breathing hard through his nose with his eyes closed, possibly managing a cracked rib from where Rex's shoulder had driven into him during the takedown. None of them had said anything in the last 20 minutes. It was fine. Gavin wasn't interested in conversation right now. He was doing something else. He was thinking about Marlon. The man in the doorway had the kind of composure that came from operational experience, rather than aggression. An operational experience meant he'd been in situations before, where the first approach didn't work, and you had to adapt. He'd adapted once already. The woodshed entry had been smart. It just hadn't been smart enough. He would adapt again. The question was what resources he still had available to him. He'd claimed 4 additional people. The detainee had said 2. The actual number was somewhere in that range, probably 3-1 still outside, positioned somewhere in the tree line, which would explain why Marlon hadn't simply waited and sent everyone through the woodshed at once. He'd split his force to cover both approaches, and it had cost him 2 men and gained him nothing. That meant Marlon was down to himself and at most 2 others. That also meant Marlon knew that a direct assault on the cabin had failed twice, that he had 3 people inside who were now a liability rather than an asset. Because if this ended with federal investigators on scene, having 3 zip-tied colleagues inside the cabin was not a position anyone wanted to explain, and that the storm was still running strong with no air support available to either side. And Gavin stood at the ruined window with his back against the wall and thought about what he would do in Marlon's position. The answer he arrived at was not comforting. He'd burn it. Cabin, necessarily a fire in a blizzard, was difficult to sustain and control, and drew exactly the kind of attention you didn't want. But the woodshed was a different calculation. The woodshed was attached. The woodshed was full of dry pine. A fire that started in the woodshed and spread through the connecting wall would do what 3 armed men had failed to do. No, with the added benefit of destroying the evidence inside Atlas's collar at the same time. He turned from the window. "We need to move," he said. Tessa had her back against the stone fireplace, Atlas across her lap, his head resting against her good wrist. Yes, T. She'd been stroking the dog's ears in the absent-minded way people touch animals when their mind is occupied with something else. She stopped when she heard his voice. Now, in the next few minutes. Before Marlin decides the cabin is more useful as a fire than as a building. She processed that, looked at the connecting woodshed door, the one that was hanging open from where the third man had come through it. If he fires the woodshed, we don't want to still be inside. Where do we go? It's a whiteout. We have 2 injured dogs, and I can barely... He was already moving, pulling his pack open, taking rapid inventory. Thermal lasers, rope, the compass, the first aid kit now partially depleted, 2 protein bars and a half-liter of water, the hand axe. One of the tactical flashlights the intruders had dropped better quality than his. With a strobe function, he might find useful. He looked at Atlas. Can he be moved? He was moved before. From the crash site. He's been resting for 2 hours since then. His leg has had a chance to stiffen. Tessa looked down at the dog. Her jaw worked for a second. He'll move if I ask him to. It wasn't bravado. He could hear the specific weight of someone saying a hard thing because it was true, rather than because it made them feel better. Okay, he said. So he pulled the space blanket from the pack and reconstructed the carry rig he'd used on the walk-in chest and left shoulder configuration, freeing up his right arm. Then he handed Tessa the tactical flashlight and his knife. She looked at the knife. I'm right-handed. I know. Your right hand works. Use it. She took the knife. Where are we actually going? Northeast. Away from the tree line where Marlin's positioned and away from the crash site. He was cross-referencing the topo map in his head. There's a seasonal service road, approximately 1.4 kilometers northeast. Maintained in winter, but it runs down to the forest service station at the base of the ridge. If we can reach the road, we can follow it without navigation tools, even in zero visibility, just keep the road surface under our feet. The service station is staffed seasonally. It's November. It's not staffed. It has a hardline phone. He looked at her. One that runs through an underground cable rather than a cell tower. Tessa was quiet for a second. Then how do you know that? I looked at the infrastructure map at the trailhead when I came in. I always look at infrastructure maps. She absorbed this. Then she did something he wasn't expecting. She almost laughed. Quite. A short exhale through her nose that was the shadow of a laugh, gone almost before it arrived. Course you do. Rex had moved to the connecting woodshed door and was standing there, nose working the gap around the frame. Alerting. Reading. The dog was pulling information from the air that neither of the humans in the room had access to, and his posture said the information wasn't alarm level yet. How much time do you think we have? Tessa asked. He might not go for the woodshed. It's one of several options. Gavin checked his watch. What I know is that staying here removes all of our options. Moving northeast gives us the road and the phone. Staying here gives us a fire, and 2 walls between us and whatever Marlin decides to do next. Some would argue 2 walls is better than a blizzard. Some would be wrong. She looked at the 3 men on the floor. What about them? They're secured. The arm injury needs medical attention within a few hours, but it's not immediately life-threatening. If we make the phone call, they get help along with everyone else. And if Marlin finds them first, that's Marlin's problem to solve. Tessa nodded slowly. She kissed Atlas once on the top of his head quickly, without making a production of it. The gesture of someone who didn't know for, certain it wasn't a last time, and then she got to her feet with the careful, rigid movement of someone managing real pain. She didn't ask for help. He didn't offer it. Ready? He said. She checked the knife in her grip. No, let's go. He picked up Atlas. They went out through the woodshed. Oh! It was the only viable exit. The front door opened toward the tree line where Marlin was positioned. The window frame was destroyed. The woodshed was the east wall, and east meant moving away from the known threat location, which was the only direction that made sense. Gavin unlatched the woodshed's exterior door, slowly, no sound, no sudden movement, and pushed it open 6 inches before stopping and letting Rex through the gap first. The dog went low and fast into the dark, paused. looked back. Clear, they went. The cold hit like a physical impact after 2 hours inside by the fire. The wind was still running hard, gusting in the upper registers and dropping briefly before climbing again, driving snow horizontally off the ridge above them. Gavin had Atlas against his chest, one arm under the dog's hindquarters, the other steadying his torso, and he could feel the Malinois' heartbeat through his jacket, fast but steady. Tessa came out behind him. He heard the sharp intake of breath when the cold hit her ribs. She pressed her splinted wrist against her side and kept moving. Rex took point without being told. They moved northeast through deep snow and absolute dark. The first 200 meters were the worst. The terrain immediately east of the cabin sloped upward before flattening and moving uphill in knee-deep snow while carrying 65 pounds of dog, with a woman beside him. Managing a fractured wrist and a cracked rib was not something Gavin would have described as comfortable under any circumstances. He could feel the burn starting in his left thigh where he'd taken the knee earlier, and the cut on his cheekbone had crusted over in the cold in a way that felt like someone had pressed a piece of gravel into his face. Kept moving. Behind them, nothing followed. Either Marlin hadn't seen them leave, or he was letting them go, which Gavin didn't believe. He was moving parallel to them in the trees, which was the scenario he was most concerned about. He ran the geometry in his head while he walked. If Marlin knew this terrain, and he probably did, or had someone with him who he knew about the service road northeast, which meant he potentially knew that's where they were heading. Which meant getting there first wasn't enough. They needed to reach the phone before Marlin could position between them and it. "Rex," he said quietly. "Pace." The dog heard the word a command for increased speed and stretched his stride. Gavin matched it. Tessa matched his pace without being asked. He'd intervened. She was working harder than he was and doing it without complaint, and he filed that information in the column of things he'd underestimated tonight. They were 400 meters from the cabin when the glow appeared behind them. He turned once, just briefly. The woodshed was burning. Orange light bleeding through the gaps in the timber walls, climbing the east face of the cabin. Marlin had made the same calculation he had, and arrived at the same answer, and acted on it. "Stop," Gavin said. Tessa didn't look back. "I can see it in your face." "Look back. Keep moving." She kept moving. The glow behind them grew and then stabilized, and then began to diminish as distance, and the storm put it behind them. In 40 minutes it was gone entirely, swallowed by the dark and the falling snow. Rex found the service road. He stopped at the boundary of what turned out to be a barely visible grade difference in the snow surface, a slight compression, where a vehicle track had packed the earth down enough that even a season of snowfall hadn't fully equalized it, and looked back at Gavin. "Good boys," Gavin said, and meant it in a way that went beyond training. They turned down the grade and followed it. It took another 50 minutes to reach the service station. It was a small structure barely larger than the fire watch cabin, with a metal roof and boarded windows and a locked steel door that had a standard Forest Service padlock securing it. Gavin had the padlock open in under 2 minutes using the tension tool and pick he kept in a flat leather case inside his pack's top pouch. He'd carried them for 10 years out of habit, and this was the second time in his life he'd used them outside of a training context. The interior was cold, same temperature as outside, effectively, but it was out of the wind, and that alone made it livable. He found the hardline phone on the wall to the left of the door, picked up the receiver, got a dial tone. He stood there for a second with the receiver in his hand. Then he dialed. Not Park's number, he didn't have it, and even if he had, calling an IG investigator on a potentially compromised line in the middle of an active operation felt like an error. He called a number he'd had for 4 years and used exactly 3 times. All 3 times in situations that required reaching someone who was reliably outside any compromised chain of command. It rang 4 times. Voice he recognized, gravel and economy. The voice of someone who picked up even at 3 in the morning because they'd learned the hard way that the calls worth ignoring were not the ones that came at 3 in the morning. The voice said, "It's Rourke." A pause. "You're supposed to be on leave." "I'm still on leave." I have a situation. Another pause. Longer, Dillard processing the fact that Gavin had used the word situation rather than any of several other words, and understanding what that meant. Talk to me, Gavin talked. He kept it tight timeline. Location, he said. Threat assessment. Tessa's status. The evidence. The name she'd given him. The name got a silence on the other end that lasted 4 full seconds, which from Dillard was the equivalent of a sharp hintef of breath. Say that name again, Dillard said. Gavin said it again. And she has documentation. Physical collar on her K9. Photographs, financial records, flight logs. Enough to open a federal case if it reaches the right people without being intercepted. You said intercepted. Someone knew about her secure briefing with Interior IG. The helicopter was hit before it reached the rendezvous. Unknown. But the name she gave me has reach into scheduling infrastructure. That's my working assumption. Dillard was quiet again. The silence of someone who didn't know what to say. The silence of someone running a very fast calculation across a large and complicated mental map. Your position. Gavin gave him the grid coordinates from memory. The station had a laminated reference map on the wall. He'd cross-referenced his estimate against it the moment he'd seen it. Weather window? 18 hours was the estimate when I last pulled it. 4 hours ago. So 14, approximately. All right. Dillard's voice had shifted into the register. It went into when he was no longer having a conversation and was instead issuing a structure. Stay where you are. Don't use that line again after this call. I'm going to make 2 calls, and then I'm going to make something happen. Sit on the evidence and sit on the woman. Can you do that? Yes, the name she gave you. There are going to be people who want to manage that outcome. You understand what I'm telling you? Yes. Make sure the evidence gets to the right people first. The first people who show up. The right people. How will I know the difference? I'm going to give you a word. When the right people come, they'll use it. Dillard said the word. It was an ordinary word, the kind of word that appeared in sentences all the time. That would sound like nothing to anyone listening. You understand? Yes. Good, now get off this line. Gavin hung up. He stood with his hand on the receiver for a moment, listening to the wind against the metal roof. Then he turned back to the room. Tessa had Atlas in her lap again on the floor, her back against the wall. Rex was lying beside the door in the position he always took when he was on watch, not sleeping, not fully alert, but in the ready state between the two that working dogs could sustain for hours without effort. Station's single oil lamp, which Tessa had found and lit while he was on the phone, threw a pale, steady light over all of them. She said, "Help is coming." "How long?" "Not before morning." "Weather window is still closed." He sat down across from her. "There are going to be people here when it opens. I don't know exactly which people or in what order." She read what was behind that. "You think Marlon has his own call-out. I think we should operate as if he does. So even when we hear rotors, we wait. We don't open that door for anyone until they give us a word." She looked at him steadily. "What word?" he told her. She repeated it once, nodded. "Okay." They sat in the oil lamplight while the storm beat against the roof, and the hours moved the way hours move when you're in a fixed position in hostile terrain, slowly, and with the particular quality of time that makes every minute feel like it needs to be accounted for. Gavin checked on Atlas twice. The Malinois was weaker than he'd been at the cabin, but he was stable, and he ate a small piece of the protein bar Gavin offered him with the automatic, uncomplicated appetite of an animal that understood the basic logic of fuel. Rex didn't eat. He was working. Around 4 a.m, Tessa said, "Tell me something." He looked at her. "What? Anything that isn't about this?" She gestured vaguely at the walls, the knife in her hand. "I've been inside this problem for 8 months. I need 60 seconds of something else." He thought about it. "My father used to come up into this range to hunt. We came up when I was 22, a week before I left for Coronado. He didn't know anything about military selection, didn't really understand what I was walking into. He just knew it was big. So he wanted to take me somewhere he understood." He looked at the lamp flame. "We didn't see a single deer. Camped 4 nights. Talked about almost nothing. A pause. I don't think I understood until much later that that was the point. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Is he still around? I'm sorry. Don't be. Hugh Gavin stopped. Tried again. He was a good man. The quiet kind. Not dramatic about it. Another pause. I think about him up here. Tessa nodded. Slowly, she looked down at Atlas. My mother was a field biologist. She used to take me into protected wilderness areas when I was a kid and make me sit still for 30 minutes and just listen. I hated it when I was 9. Absolutely hated it. Her mouth curved slightly. I understand now why she did it. They sat in that for a while. The storm didn't relent. The oil lamp burned steadily. Rex watched the door. Just before 6 in the morning, Gavin heard something beneath the wind that hadn't been there before. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand, and Rex was on his feet at the same moment, and Tessa was lifting her head from where she'd been half dozing with Atlas against her side. What she started? Quiet. He pressed his ear to the door. Listened. Footsteps in the snow. More than one person. Moving with purpose towards the station from the northwest, from the direction of the service road. Trying to be quiet, he stepped back from the door, picked up the hand axe, positioned himself against the wall to the right of the frame, where the door would swing away from him if it opened inward. Tessa dragged herself to her feet, knife up, back to the far wall, protecting Atlas with her body. A fist hit the door. 3 knocks. Sharp. A woman's voice. Controlled, clear, projected over the wind. My name is Special Agent Sandra Park. I'm with the Interior Department Office of Inspector General. I was contacted approximately 2 hours ago by a source who gave me this location and told me to give you a word when I arrived. Gavin said nothing. The word is, she said it. He exhaled once, slow and controlled. And he lifted the interior latch and opened the door. Sandra Park was in her mid-40s, shorter than he'd expected based on her voice, with frost cut on her jacket collar, and the expression of someone who had been awake for 30 hours and was running on professionalism and cold air. Behind her were 2 men in unmarked tactical gear and 1 woman in a Forest Service uniform who was already pulling a medical kit from her pack before she was fully through the door. Park looked at the room, at Gavin, at Tessa, at the 2 dogs and the oil lamp and the knife in Tessa's hand. She looked at Atlas. Is that the collar? She said. Yes, Tessa said. Park nodded. Something moved across her face, relief, or maybe the particular expression of someone who has been working toward a single fixed point for a long time and has just arrived there. Okay, she said. We have a secure transport route down the east face. Weather window is thin, but it's enough. She looked at Gavin. Contact said to tell you, the rest is handled. Handled how? The 3 men at the cabin were found and are in custody. Marlon Voss, I'm guessing you know, that name by now, was detained 40 minutes ago at a staging point 2 kilometers south of the ridge. He made 1 phone call before we shut down his communications. That call is what told us where you were. She paused. He called a number that we've been watching for 6 weeks. Tessa made a sound that was not quite a word, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, releasing by 1 degree. The name in the caller records, Tessa said. You know, Park said. We've known for 3 weeks. What we didn't have was the documentation chain that closes it. She looked at Atlas again. At the caller. That's what closes it. The room was quiet except for the wind and the sound of the medic working. She'd moved immediately to Atlas without being asked, reading the leg injury with practiced hands, pulling supplies from her kit with the efficiency of someone who treated field trauma as routine. Gavin set the hand axe down on the floor. He felt the weight of the last several hours settling into his body all at once, the way exhaustion waits until the immediate crisis clears before presenting its bill. His thigh was genuinely painful now. His cheekbone had stiffened around the crusted cut. He was aware of being very cold in a way he hadn't let himself notice while there was still work to do. Rex patted over and pressed his flank against Gavin's leg. He put his hand on the dog's shoulder without looking down. Park had moved to Tessa and was speaking to her in a low, direct voice operational language. Logistics, use, next steps. Tessa was responding the same way, and watching Gavin had the clear impression of two people who thought in similar structures finally in the same room together, moving fast through a lot of ground. He stepped back and let them work. One of Park's tactical agents, the taller of the two, with an angular face that registered nothing in particular, had taken a position by the door and was monitoring the approach with a device Gavin recognized as a military-grade motion sensor. Good equipment. Better than he'd expected from an IG operation, which suggested either Park had requested joint support or someone above her level had decided this situation warranted resources that didn't usually flow to administrative investigations. That answered one question he'd had about the name Tessa had given him. People didn't deploy this kind of response to protect a mid-level contractor operation. Agent Park, he said. She looked up from her conversation with Tessa. How high does it go? Park looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Tessa, and Tessa looked at Gavin, and something passed between the three of them in such silence that didn't need to be spoken. High enough, Park said, that this conversation happened in a Forest Service station in a blizzard instead of a conference room in Washington. Gavin nodded. That was enough. Through the metal walls of the station, the wind was beginning to shift. The leading edge of the storm, bleeding its energy against the eastern face of the ridge, carrying with it the first faint suggestion, not warmth, not yet, the meteorological promise of warmth, eventually of what came after. Atlas lifted his head. He looked at Tessa. His tail moved once. Slow and effortful and entirely certain. She put her hand on his face and didn't say anything, and Gavin looked away because some things weren't his to witness. Rex sat beside him in the lamplight and watched the door. The transport down the east face took 90 minutes. Park's team had come up with 2 sleds, lightweight aluminum frames with nylon webbing, the kind used in mountain search and rescue operations, and Atlas rode on one of them wrapped in a thermal blanket, while Tessa walked beside him with her hand resting on the frame. She didn't hold the sled. She just kept her hand there. Gavin noticed but didn't say anything about it. Rex ran the descent the way he ran everything ahead, checking back, ahead again. The tactical agent with the angular face took rear position. The medic stayed close to Atlas and monitored him every 10 minutes with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that the difference between a stable patient and a critical one could develop in the gap between check sex. Park walked beside Gavin. She didn't talk for the first 20 minutes. He appreciated that. The terrain demanded attention, and the footing was bad, and there was nothing useful to say that couldn't wait until they were somewhere that wasn't a 40-degree slope in residual blizzard conditions. When the grade leveled out, and the trees opened into the access road that ran south toward the valley, she said, "Your contact didn't tell me much about you. He told you enough. He told me to trust the word, and trust the man. That's not much. It's everything from Dillard." Park glanced at him sideways. "You've worked with him long?" 7 years. Said, "You're on leave." "I am. Temporary." Yes, she was quiet for a moment, working through whatever calculation she was running. "The men you detained in the cabin. The one with the arm injury is going to need surgery. The arm is apparently quite damaged." He pointed a weapon at a woman with a head wound and a broken wrist. "I'm not criticizing. I'm informing." She adjusted her pace to match the improved footing. "Are going to be questions about the cabin, about the level of force used. There were 3 of them and 2 of us, one of whom was injured. That I'm telling you what the questions are going to look like, not what my conclusions are." She paused. "My conclusions are that Tessa Vaughn and her evidence are intact, and the individuals who attempted to destroy both are in custody." "Those are good conclusions." Gavin said nothing. "The questions are going to come from people who have different priorities than my conclusions," Park continued. "And some of those people are going to be in rooms you'll need to sit in." He looked at her. "What kind of rooms?" "The kind with a table and a recorder, and someone who needs the record to reflect a version of events that's useful to them." She met his gaze evenly. "I'm giving you advance notice, because your contact asked me to, and because I think you deserve to walk into those rooms knowing they exist." He thought about that for the rest of the descent. The valley staging area was a flat clearing where Park's transport vehicles were parked: two heavy-duty Forest Service SUVs and a medical response van with its rear doors open. A generator was running, powering a portable light array that made the clearing look almost clinical against the pre-dawn dark. No. 3 additional federal agents were there, and 2 of them came forward immediately when the group emerged from the tree line. One of them was on a satellite phone. He held up a hand when he saw Park and said something quick and quiet into the receiver, then lowered it. "Got confirmation on the Harlan detention," he said. He was picked up at his residence at 0430. "Didn't resist." "Of course he didn't," Park said. She said it without satisfaction. "Just acknowledgement." The second agent, a woman with close-cropped hair and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been waiting a long time for something, looked at Tessa, then at Atlas, then at the caller. "Is that—" "Yes," Park said. "Do you want to pull the data here, or controlled environment?" "Chain of custody matters." "Right." The woman stepped back. "Right." Tessa was taken to the medical van. Gavin started to follow, and one of the agents stepped slightly into his path, not blocking him, just indicating, and Park said, "Let them work." "She's in good hands." He stopped. Rex sat beside him and watched the van. "She's going to be fine," Park said. "I know that." "Atlas." Park followed his gaze to where the medic and one of the other agents were carefully moving the Malinois from the sled into the van's interior. The dog was conscious, alert, following Tessa with his eyes even as they moved him. "The nearest veterinary trauma facility is 60 kilometers south," Park said. "We have a vehicle standing by his leg. The medic thinks it's a complex fracture. Repairable, most likely." He said repairable. She paused. "He's an old dog. He's a working dog." "There's a difference?" Gavin looked at her. To him, yes. Park absorbed this and let it go. One of the SUVs had its heater running. Gavin sat in the back with Rex and drank the coffee. Someone handed him, without being asked, black, too hot. The kind of coffee that tasted like it had been made 3 hours ago and kept warm on a hot plate, which was exactly the kind of coffee he wanted. Rex curled against his leg and was asleep in 90 seconds. He didn't sleep. He sat with the coffee and looked out the window at the clearing and thought about the rooms Park had mentioned. The rooms came faster than he expected. By 8 in the morning, they were at a Forest Service administrative center, 40 kilometers south of the ridge. A real building with actual heat and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Tessa had been transported from there to a hospital in Kalispell for the rib and the wrist, taking Atlas with her in a separate vehicle headed to the trauma vet 2 blocks from the hospital. Gavin had been given dry clothes from a supply cabinet Forest Service issue, 2 sizes too large, and a meal that he ate standing up in a break room because sitting down felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make yet. A man in a suit walked into the break room and asked him to come down the hall. The man's name was Calloway. He didn't offer a title or an agency affiliation, which told Gavin more than a title would have. He was in his 50s, lean, with a particular blankness of expression that some people cultivated deliberately because they'd learned that showing their thinking was a disadvantage. The room had a table, a recorder, 2 chairs. Park was already there, sitting against the wall to the side rather than at the table, which told him she was present as an observer rather than a participant. She gave him a look when he came in that was brief and entirely communicative. "Be careful. Be accurate. Be complete." Calloway sat across the table from Gavin and turned on the recorder and said the date and time and the names of people present. Then he folded his hands on the table and said, "Walk me through last night from the beginning." Gavin walked him through it. He was precise. He didn't editorialize. He stated what he had observed, what he had inferred, and on what basis, what actions he had taken and why. He used the same language he used in operational debriefs, active voice, specific timestamps where he had them, clear separation between confirmed facts and working assumptions. He described the crash site assessment, including the puncture in the frame. He described finding Tessa and Atlas and the decision to move to the cabin. He described the 3 intruders, the sequence of events the level of force used, and his justification for each decision. Calloway listened without interrupting. When Gavin finished, Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The man with the arm injury. You made a specific choice there." "I made the choice that neutralized the threat with available tools. He's going to be looking at reconstructive surgery. He had a loaded weapon aimed at a critically injured federal officer. You didn't know she was a federal officer when you pulled from the wreck." Gavin looked at him. "I knew she was a person." Calloway held his gaze for a second. Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind his eyes. The data extraction sequence for the collar unit. It wasn't a question. "She told me in case she didn't make it to the station," Gavin said. "Contingency. And did you transmit it to anyone?" "Your contact Dillard, you didn't give it to him when you called?" "I gave him location and threat assessment, and the name Tessa gave me." "That's all." Calloway nodded slowly, made a note on the legal pad in front of him, which was the first time he'd written anything. "The name she gave you. I need you to state it clearly for the record." Gavin stated it clearly for the record. Calloway wrote it down. His pen moved carefully, the way people write when they know what they're writing what is going to be read by more people than are currently in the room. "And your source for that name is Tessa Vaughn's verbal statement." "Yes. Made under duress. Damaged cabin. Post-crash. Concussed." Gavin felt the shape of what Calloway was doing, made clearly and specifically, and repeated twice at my request for confirmation, with supporting documentation in the collar unit that corroborates it independently. Collar unit's data hasn't been formally extracted yet, but it will be. When it is, there will be a process for determining what it actually shows versus what Officer Vaughn believes it shows. I understand that, and you understand that until that process is complete. "I understand what you're doing," Gavin said. Calloway stopped. The room was quiet for a moment. "I'm doing my job," Calloway said. "You're building a record that creates distance between this office and whatever comes out of the collar data before you know what that is." Gavin kept his voice level. "Aggressive. Just accurate. In case what comes out is something that's inconvenient for people at a level above yours." Calloway's expression didn't change. That was its own answer. Park against the wall had gone very still. "I'm going to tell you what I observed," Gavin said. "I observed a wilderness officer who spent 8 months collecting evidence at personal risk, who was dismissed and patronized by her chain of command, who was targeted with lethal force to prevent that evidence from reaching the right people. I observed 3 men attempt to kill her in a cabin. I observed a dog protect her evidence through a fractured leg and a crash impact that should have finished him." He paused. "I'm going to state all of that, clearly and accurately, for your record, and then the record is going to exist. And whatever you decide to do with it is your business. But I want to make sure you understand that the record is complete." Calloway looked at him for a long moment. His pen was still on the legal pad. He wasn't writing. "You're very composed for someone who spent the night in a blizzard, fighting off armed men," he said. "I've had worse nights, I believe you." A pause. "Where, specifically? That information is classified above your clearance level." Calloway's mouth tightened slightly. "You know that for a fact?" "My clearance level is. I'm making a reasonable inference about yours, based on what agency you're willing to put your name to in this room." Park made a sound against the wall. It might have been a cough. Calloway looked down at his legal pad, made another note. "Petty Officer Rourke, Chief Petty Officer. Chief Petty Officer Rourke. I need to ask you about the period between approximately 0100 and 0300 when you were in the cabin with 3 restrained individuals and Officer Vaughn. During that time, what was the nature of the information she shared with you about the evidence and its contents?" Gavin told him. He was complete. He left nothing out. He described the conversation about the collar, payment, records, flight schedules, the financial chain, the LLC designation, the name. He described the 8-digit sequence and stated that he had given it to no one. When he finished, Calloway looked at his notes. "You have a good memory. Training and practice. Calloway tapped his pen against the legal pad once. A decision being made that he wasn't going to announce out loud. All right, I think that covers what I need for now. We may have follow-up questions as the investigation develops. I'll be available, Gavin said, through Dillard's office. We'll go through your chain of command directly. That's fine. Dillard will route whatever you need. He stood. Calloway stood. They did not shake hands. At the door, Calloway said, Chief Petty Officer. Gavin stopped, but didn't turn. The man with the arm. For what it's worth, based on the evidence at the scene and Officer Vaughn's statement, your actions in the cabin appear consistent with lawful defense of self and others under the circumstances. Gavin turned, looked at him. I know, he said. He left the room. Park caught up with him in the hallway. That went better than I expected, she said. Calloway was fishing. Calloway is always fishing. That's his job. She fell into step beside him. What he got from you was a clean record that corroborates Tessa's account on every material point. That matters more than you might think right now. Why? Because Tessa is going to sit in a room like that in about 4 hours, as soon as the hospital clears her, and the version of events she tells needs to match yours without either of you having coordinated it. Which is only possible if both of you were telling the truth. She paused. Which you were. Yes. So that's good. They reached a junction in the hallway. Park stopped the caller data. It's going to take our forensic team approximately 6 hours to extract and catalog everything once we have her in a controlled environment for the sequence. After that, she stopped. After that, the name gets confirmed independently, Gavin said. Yeah, and Calloway's careful record stops being useful as a hedge. Pause. He's not a bad man. He's a man who has survived a long time in a complicated environment by being careful. I know the type. I thought you might. She looked at him with the direct, appraising look of someone who had spent a career reading people quickly and accurately. What are you going to do when your leave ends? Go back. Just like that. That was always the plan. The plan changed a few times last night. Plan adjusted. It didn't change. He looked down the hallway. Rex was waiting at the far end by the exterior door, sitting upright, watching him. Plan was always to go back. Park nodded. She seemed to want to say something else. Decided against it. Yet someone will drive you to wherever you need to go. The trailhead. I left my truck there, she almost smiled. Course you did. He was sitting on the hood of the Forest Service SUV in the parking lot, letting the morning air, still cold but thinning, storm broken now, and the sky beginning to show gray-blue behind the cloud remnants work on the exhaustion that had settled into him like water into stone when his phone found a signal for the first time in 36 hours. It buzzed 3 times in sequence. Messages queued. He looked at them. 2 from his sister in Spokane. She'd seen something on a news aggregator about an incident in the Whitefish Range and wanted to know if he was anywhere near it. 1 from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a hospital extension in Kalispell. Called the hospital number. This is Rourke, he said when someone picked up. Hold please. A pause. Then Tessa's voice, which was hoarser than it had been in the cabin, which probably meant the rib situation was worse in proper medical light than it had been in firelight and adrenaline. She said, how's the rib? 2 fractures. They're talking about a brace for 6 weeks and strongly suggesting I considered the possibility that I'm not invincible. Medical professionals often say things like that. I usually ignore them. I'm considering listening this time. A short pause. Atlas is in surgery, I know. Park told me it's a repairable fracture. The vet thinks he'll walk without a limp. I'm trying not to have feelings about that in a way that will require explaining to the nurses. Understood. He's 11 years old, she said, which is for a working Malinois. A silence. Not uncomfortable. Thank you, she said. For the record, in a formal way, I didn't do a very good job of that last night. We're busy. Still, another pause. Park called me before you got out of that room. She said you gave a complete statement. Yes. She said Calloway tried to soften the record and you didn't let him. I just told what happened. That's what she said. A brief silence. The name. Is there going to be anything that comes back on you for that? He thought about it honestly. I don't know. Probably some version of something. Because of me. Because of what's right. He said it without weight. Just fact. Don't carry that. She was quiet for a moment. Harlan called me paranoid. In that meeting. The exact word. Paranoid and inexperienced and unable to distinguish between genuine anomalies and routine operational noise. A pause. I've thought about that word every day for 8 months. And now I'm in a hospital bed with 2 broken ribs and a dog in surgery and federal agents outside my door. And apparently the name I gave you last night is going to result in a great many people having a very bad few weeks. The ghost of something satisfaction was too simple a word for it, but in that direction was audible in her voice. So I think paranoid was the wrong word. He got off the hood of the SUV and stretched his back. The sky to the east was definitively lightening now, the specific blue-gray of early morning in mountain country, the kind that preceded real color. Rex stood up from where he'd been lying in the snow beside the vehicle and shook himself thoroughly and looked at Gavin with the clear, patient expression of a dog, who was ready for whatever came next and was quietly wondering when it would begin. Rest, Gavin told him. Rex sat back down, unconvinced but compliant. There's going to be a review of Harlan's district operations, Tessa said. Park told me. Everything he dismissed, closed, redirected. 18 months of field reports from a dozen officers are going to be things that got buried that weren't mine. People who reported things and got told they were wrong. Pause. That matters to me. Not just the main case. People who she stopped. Restarted. I know what it does to you. What you saw, and someone tells you that you didn't see it. When the institution you're supposed to trust tells you that your own observations aren't reliable. Her voice was controlled, but only just. Does something to a person. Yes, I just want them to know that it wasn't them. That they were right. They'll know, he said. The record will tell them. Silence. Longer. Are you going back? When your leave ends? Right. A breath. Of course. Another breath. When Rex froze by that creek, when I heard you, coming through the wreck looking for survivors, I thought you were with them. Thought you were there to finish it. I know. I still let you help me. Your dog was injured, and you didn't have options. That's true, but also, she stopped. Also, I looked at your face when you found Atlas in the harness. And nobody performs that, the way you were with him. That's not something you fake. He didn't say anything. I'm a field officer, she said. I read what I observed. That's the job. I know. Okay. Her voice shifted slightly, the practical register coming back, the emotion filed back where it lived when there was still business to conduct. Park's people are going to need the extraction sequence in about 3 hours. I'll handle it from here. I know you will. Get some sleep, Rourke. You, too. He hung up. He stood in the parking lot with the phone in his hand, and the cold morning light building across the mountains and the sound of the Forest Service Center behind him, voices, equipment, the specific organized noise of a large institutional response getting itself into gear, and he felt the shape of the last 16 hours, the way you feel a long road after you've stopped driving. Present in the body, mapped in the muscles. The caller data was going to take 6 hours to extract and catalog. The formal investigation would take months. The name Tessa had given him, the one that had made even Dillard go silent for 4 seconds, would generate federal action at a level that wouldn't be in the news for a while if it was ever in the news at all. Things at that altitude rarely were. Harlan would cooperate. Men like Harlan always cooperated when the alternative became clear. Marlon Voss would not cooperate, which meant he would be the one who actually faced trial. While the people who had hired him made arrangements, that was a frustrating truth about how these things worked that Gavin had no power to change. The 3 men from the cabin were in federal custody, and the man with the reconstructive surgery ahead of him would have time in recovery to consider the choices that had led him to a wilderness cabin in Montana in a blizzard, pointing a weapon at a woman with a fractured wrist, and whether those choices had been worth it. Park had her data. Her case was intact. Atlas was in surgery on a repairable fracture. Tessa was in a hospital bed, being strongly encouraged to acknowledge human limitations. Rex was sitting in the snow, looking at him with the patient, ready attention of a dog who had done his job and was prepared to do it again whenever required. Gavin put his phone in his pocket. He looked at the mountains, the White Fish Range, white and dark-treed and enormous, the ridgeline where White Glass Ridge disappeared into the morning sky, still carrying a fringe of cloud from the night storm. From here it looked exactly like what it was, a mountain range. Beautiful, indifferent, permanent. Somewhere up there, the wreckage of a helicopter was buried under new snow. Somewhere up there, a firewatch cabin had a burned woodshed, and 3 walls and evidence of a night that would eventually become a case file, and then a legal proceeding, and then, eventually, a closed record in a federal archive somewhere. Pilot's name had been Garrett Folsom. He'd been 43. Park had told him that in the clearing, quietly, when Tessa was out of earshot. He'd had a wife and 2 daughters in Bozeman. Park's office was handling the notification. Gavin stood with that for a moment, gave it the space it was owed. Then he looked at Rex. "Come on," he said. The dog stood up immediately. They walked back inside. The debrief room smelled like burnt coffee and dry erase markers and the specific institutional staleness of a building that had been heated too hard for too long. Yes, he'd intervened, and Gavin sat in it for 4 more hours that morning, answering follow-up questions from 2 additional agents who had driven up from Missoula and needed to build their own version of the record from scratch. He answered everything twice, sometimes 3 times. Phrased differently each time, because that was how you tested consistency, and he understood that and didn't take it personally. The agents were professional and thorough, and one of them had the specific quality of someone who had decided in advance that the civilian who'd spent the night in a cabin with armed men was probably exaggerating something. At the end of the 2nd hour, that agent had stopped trying to find the exaggeration and was just writing down what Gavin said. Rex slept under the table throughout. Nobody asked him to move. Park came in twice. Once to provide her own corroborating statement, which she did with the efficient precision of someone who had testified in federal proceedings before and knew exactly how much information served the record and how much was noise. Once to tell Gavin quietly, at the door, the caller data extraction had begun and the preliminary review of the financial records was already generating results that she described as significant and left it at that. He read significant correctly. He didn't push for more. The 2nd session ended, and the agents from Missoula packed up their recorders and drove back south. Gavin went to the break room, ate a sandwich someone had left on the table that probably wasn't meant for him, and called Dillard. "It's handled," Dillard said, before Gavin said anything. "Define handled. Your JAG contact has been briefed. There's a file being built on your behalf that documents the self-defense justification with supporting federal agent testimony. Callaway's office sent a preliminary finding this morning. Already, they move fast when they want to move fast." A pause. "The finding is clean. No adverse action. The arm injury is being treated as an incidental outcome of lawful force in an emergency context. The man needed reconstructive surgery. He pointed a loaded weapon at a federal officer. The finding is clean, Rourke. Take it." Gavin ate the last of the sandwich. Dillard was quiet for a moment, being handled at a level that isn't yours or mine to worry about. "What I know is that the data from the caller is corroborating everything Vaughn documented, and the financial chain is longer, and goes further than even she knew. Park's office has been working this for 6 weeks, and they were missing the physical documentation to close it. They have it now, and the people who need to answer for it. Answer for it." Another pause. Slowly, loudly. "In rooms with cameras, which is actually more consequential than the alternative, even if it's less satisfying in the short term." Gavin looked at the window. Outside, the sky was fully light now, pale winter blue, clean after the storm. The mountains visible on the northern horizon, with new snow bright on their upper faces. Harland, cooperating, fully. He's been cooperative since approximately 6 this morning, which is when he understood the scope of what Vaughn had actually collected. Dillard's voice carried something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in that vicinity. 8 months of a junior field officer collecting evidence that a district manager told her didn't exist. The man spent 8 months telling her she was seeing things. He spent this morning telling federal agents everything she saw. Gavin didn't say anything. Get some rest, Dillard said. Your leave has 9 days left. Use them. I left my gear on the mountain. Buy new gear and use that. He hung up. He drove to Kalispell that afternoon. Not because anyone asked him to. Because there was operational reason. Not because there was operational reason. He drove because the truck had been sitting at the trailhead for 36 hours and needed to move. And because Kalispell was the direction the road went when you came down from the Whitefish Range. And because he was not going to leave this thing unfinished with 60 miles of mountain between him and the hospital where Tessa Vaughn was being held overnight for observation, while 2 federal agents stood in the hallway outside her room. He found parking and went inside and told the front desk he was there to see Officer Vaughn, and they called up and after a short wait told him room 214. The federal agents outside her door looked at his ID and looked at him, and one of them made a call and then nodded and stepped aside. He went in. She was sitting up in the bed, which looked like it had taken some negotiation with the nursing staff based on the pillow arrangement behind her. She was in a hospital gown, and the brace on her wrist was fresh white, and her ribs were taped under the gown in a way that affected how she held herself slightly rigid, breathing controlled. The head laceration had been properly sutured, and the bruising around her temple had come up fully in the last several hours, spreading into a deep purple-yellow crescent below her left eye. She looked objectively like someone who had survived a helicopter crash and a night in a blizzard and 2 separate violent encounters, and then been admitted to a hospital and poked repeatedly by medical professionals. She looked at him when he came in and said, "You look worse than I do." Doubt that. You have a bruise on your cheekbone the size of a hand. It's a fist-sized bruise. It feels like the right size. He pulled the chair from beside the window and sat down. Rex went immediately to the side of the bed and put his chin on the mattress edge. Tessa reached down with her good hand and touched the top of his head, and Rex closed his eyes with the expression of an animal who has determined that this was an acceptable outcome to a difficult situation. Atlas, Gavin said. Out of surgery. I said it went well. She said it with the careful flatness of someone who had been told good news, but hadn't fully let themselves believe it yet. They're keeping him overnight, and then I can see him in the morning. The vet said she said he'll need 6 weeks of restricted movement and physical therapy after that. A pause. She also said he's 11, and his recovery is going to be slower than it would have been at 6, and She stopped. She said to be realistic about what he comes back to. What did you say? I said he's Atlas, and he'll decide for himself what he comes back to. Her jaw was set. She wrote something on her clipboard and nodded in the way medical professionals nod when they decided not to argue with you. Gavin almost smiled, almost. Park called me, Tessa said. An hour ago. What did she say? The caller data is fully extracted. Cataloged. Everything I documented is there, all of it. Intact, chain of custody established. She looked at her hands. The braced wrist. The good hand, which had a small cut across 2 knuckles, from the cabin that nobody had thought to treat properly in the sequence of events. She said the financial records show payments going back 14 months. Longer than I thought. There are 3 additional names that came out of the payment chains that I didn't have. People I didn't know to look for. That's good. 2 of them are in agency roles. Her voice was very controlled. 2 of them reviewed reports that I filed and closed them without escalation. I thought it was Harland. I thought Harland was the wall. She paused. He was just 1 layer. You still got through it. Barely counts. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going gold at the edges, the particular light of late winter afternoons in mountain country, clear and low and brief. It came through the window and lay across the floor in a long rectangle and didn't quite reach the bed. They're going to reassign me, she said. Not punitively. Park made that clear. But the district is compromised. Everyone who served under Harland is going to be reviewed. Everyone who filed reports that got closed is going to be interviewed. Operational structure of the district is essentially suspended pending investigation. She looked at the window. She offered me a temporary assignment with her office during the investigation period. Field advisory role, helping them understand the terrain and the operational patterns. Are you going to take it? I already said yes. A brief pause. I said yes, and then immediately second-guessed myself, and she said that was normal, and I should stop second-guessing, and I told her I'd try. She looked at him. I'm not good at not second-guessing myself. You made good decisions last night. Yes, Hirin. I made a decision 8 months ago to start keeping a separate record instead of pushing harder through official channels. I've wondered since then if I should have pushed harder. Gone to the press, gone directly to federal investigators without waiting to build a complete picture first. She paused. People might have found those sites sooner, or you might have been shut down before you had enough to close it. She didn't sound convinced. I need to sit with the part where I knew something was wrong for 8 patients, and I don't know if that was the right choice or the cautious one dressed up as the right one. He thought about this honestly, because she wasn't asking for reassurance, and she would recognize reassurance if he offered it and it would land wrong. Probably both, he said, at the same time. That's usually how it works. She looked at him. That's not very comforting. No. Think so. She nodded slowly. Looked at Rex, who had fallen partially asleep with his chin still on the mattress edge in an arrangement that looked structurally uncertain but seemed to be working. What about you? She said. What happens to you? Leave ends in 9 days. I go back. To your unit. Yes. And whatever it was that made your commanding officer tell you to go somewhere quiet. He was still for a moment. Yes. She didn't push. She was a field officer. She understood that some terrain you didn't enter without an invitation. Will it be okay? I don't know yet. It was the most honest thing he'd said about himself in longer than he could precisely identify, and it sat in the room between them with a weight that neither of them tried to reduce. Dillard called it rest, Gavin said. I don't think he actually meant rest. I think he meant some situations need distance before you can see them clearly. You can't debrief something properly while you're still inside it. Are you clearer? He thought about the mountain. Creek where Rex had stopped, the wreck site and what he'd found there, and the decision that had taken approximately 4 swankins to make, and then had simply been made. He thought about the cabin and the fire and the 8 digits Tessa had trusted him with in the dark. Thought about the pilot. Garrett Folsom, Satin, 43 years old, two daughters in Bozeman, who had not been given the option of a decision. Getting there, he said. He stayed for another hour. They talked about things that weren't the K-Mother's fieldwork, a particular valley in the Whitefish Range that Tessa described as the most completely silent place she'd ever stood. Veent the question of whether Rex would be eligible for the mountain search and rescue program she'd mentioned in passing the previous night. That last one turned into a longer conversation than either of them expected, because Tess knew the certification pathway in detail and had opinions about which instructors were genuinely good and which ones were technically competent but poor at reading dogs. And Rex lifted his head at some point during this conversation as if he understood he was being discussed and was reserving judgment. When Gavin stood to leave, Tessa said, "The 8 digits." He stopped. "You still have them?" "Yes. I'm going to need to formally notify Park that I shared that sequence with you, so it can be documented as part of the chain of custody record." She met his eyes. "She's going to ask why I trusted you with it." "What are you going to tell her?" "The truth." She paused. "That you had just carried an injured dog through a blizzard and secured 2 detainees and were offering me something real when all I had was risk. And that I'm a field officer, and I read what I observe." He stood there for a moment with that. "Rourke," she said. "Thank you for not leaving." He nodded once. He and Rex walked out. The 9 remaining days of leave were different from the days before the crash. He drove back up to the Whitefish Range, not to White Glass Ridge specifically, but to a trailhead 40 kilometers south that accessed a different watershed, terrain he hadn't covered. Camped for 4 nights. He slept badly the first night, and well the second, and adequately after that. He thought about Garrett Fulton more than he expected to. He thought about the last rotation more than he had in the weeks before it, which was the opposite of what he'd anticipated. And after 2 days of this, he understood that Dillard had been right distance. Didn't mean the thing went away. It meant you finally had enough room to look at it directly without flinching. He looked at it directly. He didn't resolve it. Some things didn't resolve in 9 days or 9 months. But he stopped carrying it in the specific way that had made Dillard send him here, the way where it was present in every room and in every moment, and in the gap between his shoulder blades when he was trying to sleep. It moved. It became something he could set down and pick back up, rather than something that had attached itself to him while he wasn't paying attention. Was enough. For now, that was enough. Rex ran the mountain trails with the uncomplicated joy of an animal who had spent 2 days doing serious work and was now permitted to be a dog. And watching him, Gavin thought about what Tessa had said, that he'll decide for himself what he comes back to, and thought that was probably the most accurate framework for most things. On the 6th day, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he'd saved the previous week. Atlas walking, unassisted, still looks annoyed about the whole thing. He read it twice. Then he wrote back, "Tell him Rex says he's a good dog." The response came 4 minutes later. He says Rex is adequate. He laughed. Actually laughed. Yes, out loud, alone on a mountain trail with nobody to hear it except Rex, who looked back at him with the alert curiosity of a dog who had never heard that sound come from this particular human before, and wasn't sure what to make of it, but was cautiously optimistic. On the 8th day, he drove into the nearest town with reliable cell service and called his sister. They talked for an hour and a half, which was longer than they'd talked in a single call in approximately 3 years. She did most of the talking. She had a lot to talk about: her job, her apartment, a person she'd been seeing for 4 months that she'd been reluctant to mention to him because she didn't want his opinion and simultaneously desperately wanted his opinion. He gave his opinion when asked and withheld it when not asked, which she noted and thanked him for, which meant he'd calibrated it correctly. Before they hung up, she said, "Are you okay?" "Actually okay, not military okay." "I think so. Getting there. That's more honest than usual." "I'm working on it." She was quiet for a second. "You sound different." "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. Less," she paused. "Less like you're standing just outside the room." He thought about that. "Good," he said. "That's probably good." On the 9th day, he drove south. He left at dawn, the mountains behind him catching the first light in their upper snowfields, while the valleys were still in gray shadow. Rex slept in the passenger seat for the first 2 hours, and then woke up and watched the landscape change through the winds with the alert, interested attention of a dog who found highway travel genuinely engaging. Gavin drove and thought about very little. This was a skill he'd been working on for years, and had never fully mastered the ability to occupy a moment without already being in the next one. He wasn't good at it, but he was better at it than he'd been 9 days ago, and he filed that as a reasonable gain. Phone buzzed, somewhere around the Wyoming border. A number he recognized as Park's. He answered on the speaker. "Park, you're on the road? Heading south. What's the status? I wanted you to hear it from me before you saw anything public." A pause that had weight in it. The name from the caller records. Federal arrest was made this morning. Concurrent with 2 additional arrests at the agency level, the 2 names that came out of the payment chain analysis. She paused again. Going to be public in approximately 3 hours. The press release is drafted. He drove for a moment without saying anything. How did it land? Like a large rock into a very quiet pond. Her voice was dry. There are people in Washington who are currently very busy revising their understanding of the last 18 months. Harland, cooperating witness. Formal agreement signed yesterday. He'll testify. A pause. He called Tessa paranoid, you know. Formal memorandum. 8 months ago. I know. That memorandum is now part of the federal case record. She let that sit for a moment. Tessa's formal commendation from the Interior Secretary's office was submitted this morning as well. Pending approval, but the submission is in. She'll find that uncomfortable. She already told me that. A brief pause, and he could hear the almost smile in it. She also told me to tell you that Rex has been formally nominated for the Northern Rockies Mountain Search and Rescue Program, and that the nomination has a strong supporting letter from a senior field officer with the Whitefish District. He looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him with the patient, self-possessed expression of a dog who already knew this and had been waiting for his handler to catch up. "Tell her thank you," Gavin said. "Tell her yourself. She's going to be in San Diego in 3 weeks for a federal witness preparation session." A pause. Incidentally, yes. Park's voice was entirely neutral. "Safe travels, Chief Petty Officer." She hung up. He reached the naval base on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after he'd left. He checked in at the gate, drove to the lot, sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. The San Diego air came through the cracked window warm, salt-edged, nothing like Montana. The sky here was different, lower and bluer, everything closer together. Gatets, Rex sat up and put his nose to the window gap and worked the air with the same attentive interest he brought to everything. Dillard was waiting outside the building, which was not standard. Dillard did not usually stand outside buildings waiting for people. He stood outside buildings when he needed to have a conversation that didn't belong inside them. Gavin got out of the truck. Rex followed. They shook hands. Dillard looked at him. The way he looked at things he was assessing, quick, thorough, making no announcement of conclusions. "You look better," he said. "You look the same. I always look the same." A pause. "How's the leg?" "Fine." "The cheek healing?" Dillard nodded. He looked at Rex, who looked back at him with equal steadiness. "The SAR nomination is going to cause some paperwork." "Worth it." "Probably." Dillard put his hands in his jacket pockets. "There's a debrief scheduled for Thursday. Nothing adversarial. JAG reviewed everything. Finding is clean. This is just the formal internal record. You'll walk in, you'll tell it straight. You'll walk out. How debriefs work, I know you know. I'm telling you this one is straightforward, so you stop bracing for it." He looked at him. "Stop bracing." Gavin exhaled. "Okay, the other thing." Dillard's voice shifted by 1 degree, still level, but the quality of it different. "Yes, the register that meant they were now talking about something that both of them had been not talking about for weeks. The Oman situation. There's a counselor I want you to meet. A requirement. A recommendation. From you, from me, yes." Gavin looked at the building, the familiar shape of it, the flag in the morning air. "Okay," he said. Dillard looked at him. "That's it? Just okay? I said I was working on some things." "You did say that. This is part of it." A pause. "It's not easy. Nobody said it was easy." He looked at his chief. "I just wanted to say it out loud. It's not easy. So somebody knows." Dillard was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the water and moved between them. "Somebody knows," he said. They walked inside. 3 weeks later, Tessa Vaughn sat across a table from Gavin Rourke in a restaurant, 2 blocks from the federal courthouse in downtown San Diego, and the first thing she did when she sat down was put her phone face up on the table to show him a photograph. Atlas, standing in a patch of winter sunlight outside what appeared to be the Kalispell Veterinary Clinic, standing unassisted, all 4 legs head up, looking directly at the camera with the dignified, slightly impatient expression of a dog who had survived a helicopter crash and a blizzard and a complex leg surgery and was annoyed that people kept taking his photograph. He walked with a limp, visible, permanent, the left rear leg bearing weight differently than the right. He didn't appear to be bothered by it. "He starts physical therapy Monday," Tessa said. "The vet says the limp is permanent, but the strength in the leg is coming back faster than projected." "Of course it is. That's exactly what I said." She put the phone down. She looked different in civilian clothes, still composed, still with the specific quality of someone who read everything around her, but less armored somehow. More visible. The bruising around her temple had faded to yellow at the edges, and would be gone within another week. The SAR program accepted Rex. I got the letter. He starts in April. I told the program director he was exceptional. He'll be embarrassed. He's a dog. He'll still be embarrassed. Gavin looked at the menu without reading it. How was the witness prep? Thorough. Long, a pause. There are going to be 6 separate proceedings. No, 2 federal criminal cases and 4 administrative reviews. I'm a material witness in all of them. She said this without complaint, just accounting. Park said it'll be 18 months minimum before the last one closes. Are you okay with that? I built the case for 8 months while people told me I was imagining it. I can spend 18 months in rooms watching it close. She turned her water glass between her hands. Commendation came through, the formal one from the secretary's office. I heard. I don't know what to do with it. You put it somewhere and you keep working. That's what I thought. She looked at him. The 2 officers in the district who had their reports buried. One of them called me last week. A woman named Delgado. She'd filed 3 separate reports about unauthorized vehicle tracks. It's in the same sector I'd documented. All 3 times in the 2 years before I arrived. All 3 closed by Harland within 48 hours. A pause. She said she'd been transferred to a desk assignment. She'd stopped trying her own observations, that she'd started to think Harland was right, and she was bad at the job. Gavin looked at her. I talked to her for an hour, Tessa said. And I told her what I knew, which was that she was right. She had always been right. The system that was supposed to support her had failed her, and that was the system's failure, and not hers. She paused. She cried. Which I wasn't expecting that. I didn't handle it very well. What did you do? I stayed on the phone until she stopped. And then she told me she was putting in for reassignment back to field work. Her hands were still on the water glass. That felt like enough. They ordered food. They ate it. Conversation moved through things that weren't the case. Rex's training program, the specific logistical challenge of moving between Kalispell and wherever Tessa was being stationed for her advisory role. No, a minor disagreement about the best elevation range for winter camping that revealed they had strongly held and completely opposite views. No, Ulguri. They argued about it for 10 minutes with the comfortable friction of people who had already been through something that made minor disagreements feel like a luxury. When they left, they stood on the sidewalk in the San Diego evening warm, the opposite of Montana in every sensory detail, and Tessa said, I'm glad Rex found me. So is he. And you. He thought about it. The honest answer, not the easy one. Yes, he said. Even the parts I'd rather not have done. Yes. She nodded. She looked like she'd expected that answer and was satisfied with it. Rourke, she said. Yeah. You should know the program director for the SAR program said Rex is one of the most naturally talented mountain dogs he's encountered in 20 years. A pause. He asked who trained him. What did you say? I said someone who doesn't need the credit. She looked at him steadily. He wrote it in the file anyway. She turned and walked toward the hotel, where the federal witness program had put her up for the week, and Gavin watched her go, and then looked down at Rex, who was sitting on the sidewalk, watching the same direction with his ears forward, and his expression one of calm, comprehensive attention. The evening traffic moved around them. The salt air came off the harbor 2 blocks west. Somewhere above the city, the first stars were coming through in the gaps between the light, faint and patient, and there whether you looked for them or not. Rex looked up at him. Come on, Gavin said. They walked back into the city. The mountains above White Glass Ridge were still white when the spring thaw began, and they would be white yet. Crash site was documented and cleared. The illegal extraction sites were shut, the equipment cataloged as evidence, the concealed access roads legally closed. The valley was quiet in the way it had been, before anyone decided it was worth exploiting the specific silence of protected wilderness, which is not the absence of sound, but the presence of sounds that belong there. Somewhere in a federal archive, a case file was open and growing. Somewhere in Kalispell, Atlas walked in the morning light with a limp and his head up, and nobody who looked at him would ever have the impression of an animal diminished. He'd intervened. Somewhere in a training facility in the Northern Rockies, Rex was learning to read terrain that he already knew how to read, and impressing people who had spent their careers being hard to impress. And in a debrief room in San Diego, a Navy SEAL who had gone looking for quiet and found something else entirely sat across from a counselor he hadn't wanted to need, and told the truth about a night in Oman, and found that the truth, once it was finally spoken out loud in a room where someone was actually listening, was something he could carry differently than he had been carrying it. Lighter, exactly. Just differently. That was the thing nobody told you about the hardest nights you survived. They didn't disappear. They became part of the landscape you moved through. The weight didn't vanish. It just stopped being the only thing you could feel. The person everyone underestimated is rarely the loudest one in the room. They're the one still standing at the end, doing the quiet work that nobody thought to watch for, and that, more often than not, is the work that actually matters.